Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you happen to be. If you're watching this later on, thank you for taking the time to find our YouTube channel and to partake of the offerings of the Auxiliary Markings Club. I'm Gregg Redner. I'm a director with the Auxiliary Markings Club. And today we're going to be talking about early French labels and hand stamps. So I hope you'll enjoy that. And if you're not a member of the Auxiliary Markings Club, you might want to think about joining us. It's very reasonable for a digital subscription, and you can find more information by searching out Auxiliary Markings Club on your preferred server. And we have an excellent journal and an increasingly diverse Zoom presentation series, which will develop over the next year. And so we hope that you might think about doing that if you haven't. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Just a moment here. There we go. All right. So I'm a very enthusiastic collector of European auxiliary labels. And I know that for some of the members of our club are much more interested, as you would expect, in the national labels and the labels of the US and the markings of the US. But as I collect Belgium, I started to discover these very interesting labels, and so it's become kind of a major sub-focus of my collecting. So today we're going to be talking about auxiliary markings and labels to 1920 from France. So why auxiliary markings, or as they're called in Europe, postal markings? Why do they matter? Well, first of all, I would say that understanding auxiliary markings and labels helps us to trace the route a particular piece of mail is followed. It tells its story, as it were. It tells us what the issues were, what steps were taken to overcome these issues. And the thing that's perhaps most fascinating to me is that understanding the origin of the labels and the markings tells us volumes about what was going on in the Postal Service at the time and the challenges that they may have been experiencing. And last of all, understanding the changes that took place in the creation and printing of postal label and markings allows us a window into the greater world of markophily. So where do these labels come from? It depends on who you talk to, but I am of the opinion that the earliest auxiliary labels were those that were used in the Bavarian states of what is now Germany. These return labels were very conspicuously used to seal mail that had been opened to discern who the sender was if it wasn't apparent on the outside of the piece of mail. So they were used in Bavaria, but also Turin and Taxis and the Württemberg district also used them. Now, up to 1852, lacquer seals were used to close open letters, which had been opened to retrieve the address. But in 1852, the first printed circular paper seals were introduced by the Rebu Commission of Hamburg, the Return Commission of Hamburg. I have never been able to find a copy of one of these. I'm certain they must be out there somewhere, but 20 years of collecting these, I've never seen one. So let's start with the ones that that are actually available and that we actually can find. So in Bavaria, the earliest known use of the labels you see on the bottom was from 1865. They're black and feature the royal arms of Bavaria with the town name in which the return letter office was situated. And you can see there are two different examples of this really fine and beautiful label. And they're known from the following cities: Augsburg, Bamberg, München, Nuremberg, Speyer, and Würzburg. And each city had their own, but they followed this common design. The earliest ones are the ones on the left, and then they were replaced by the ones in the middle. And it depends on which scholars you believe, whether the ones on the right are the third incarnation or whether they are a variation on the first one. I am not moved either way. There just are some differences. Here's a full sheet of the labels from Augsburg, and there's some things that you can see if you look at this sheet. Number one, they were printed, 5 by 7, so there were 35 labels in a sheet. They are not perforated, which meant they had to be cut. So finding these with really nice margins is very difficult indeed. And we're going to get to the lack of perforation and why this is important in terms of changes that took place in France, and you can by extension also say England a little bit later on. The first generation labels are the ones that we saw, and they were replaced in 1869 by these labels. Now, as often happens, these labels weren't nearly as attractive and didn't require nearly as much work to produce and engrave as the original labels did. But they served the same cities, and they were typeset, not engraved. So in 1871, a UPU directive mentioned that all return letters should be opened to discern the name of the sender. These open letters were to be stamped unbestellbar, undeliverable, and sealed with a blue or black label. And the process at this point gives absolutely no indication of why the letter was returned. And here are examples of these sealing labels that were used in Germany. There again, these are slightly more rare than the ones that we saw in 1862, but they serve the same purpose, and they exist for larger cities and principalities. In July 1868, changes had taken place in French postal regulations as well. One result was the production of a round label printed in black, and it had nothing in the center of it, and the postman was to write the reason for the return in the center of the label. When the sender's name appeared on the outside and could be when the sender's name appeared on the outside of letters that could not be delivered, they were simply returned. But if they were not able to discern who the sender was, as in the case of the German situation, they would open to find some sort of indication of the city or the person's name in an attempt to return it. But at this point, there's no mention of this return process in the French post office having used labels. And you'll see an example on the right of the standard return label with the postal department, the post office number stamped on it, that many of us are familiar with. At the Second General Postal Union Congress in Paris, May 2 to June 4, 1878, 38 countries and colonies gathered to ratify the Convention of Paris, which would change the name of the organization from the GPU to the UPU. At the meeting, a very minor discussion was conducted concerned with the growing international nature of the Postal Service. As postal historians, apologies for the fire truck, you as many fire trucks, it sounds like. You as postal historians will be aware that in the beginning, much mail was local or at best national. And with the introduction of stamps and more modern postal handling and postal routes, the international realm of the post became greatly increased. And so the small exchange expressed a concern over the proper handling of mail that moves from one purview of one country's administration to another. And the concern was that if somebody spent money to send an international letter and they get it returned, they ought to have a sense of why it was returned and what the issue was. The subject of postal labels didn't appear until the end of the 19th century, when it was first raised in terms of returned mail. The issue of properly, consistently identifying the reason for mail's return was first raised in connection with the Agreement of Paris, as we've seen. But in 1887, the following clause took effect for members of the UPU. Quote, all letters and other items which for one reason or another cannot be delivered to the administration of a country of destination must, on the reverse, in French, explain the reason for non-delivery. This advice can be by means of a hand stamp or by applying a sticker. If desired, a warning in the country's own language may also be added. Of course, French was the language of the UPU as it remains to this day. But most labels, even early labels, were printed in two languages. There are a few really rare ones that weren't. There's a Finnish label which is printed only in French for unknown party or unknown address, which is inconnu. And there are only two of those known, so it was quite rare to have labels that were only in the in French. So dispatch number 10 also suggested that the primary vehicle for marking return mail would now be the hand stamp. And I apologize for the quality of this picture. I just bought a full set of these French hand stamps and have not gotten them yet, so I didn't have the opportunity to get a better picture. But there where hand stamps were not available, a sticker could be used as well. However, the inference is clear that manuscript markings were causing increasing difficulty because they were hard to read or were imprecise in terms of the reasons given, if any reason was given at all. It would be another 4 years before the decision to utilize postal labels for the purpose would be mandated. At the 1891 UPU conference held in Vienna, the Congress delegates restated the policy of stating clearly when mail was not deliverable, what the reason was, and they said the correspondence that is undeliverable must be returned with the reason for deliverability stated. Here's a directive from 1892 that was found in the Belgian postal report from the UPU. In other words, what had been mandated in the postal report was reported to Belgian postmasters. And it says a direction, it doesn't say this exactly, but a directive to the effect mandated that the use of new labels on return mail was to take effect July 1st, 1892, and would at first be applied only to international correspondence. This is actually really interesting because, of course, international correspondence was the focus of the directive and the new rule. So it's very interesting when you find these on local mail, and you can occasionally, although not terribly often, and those labels are more highly prized, of course, the use of those. The goal of the change was to transfer responsibility for the oversight to the frontier offices, which would be responsible for checking to make sure all proper protocols had been followed when declaring a letter was undeliverable. This included checking to see that the proper address had been tried and whether the mail in question could or should have been forwarded. The labels were designed to confirm that proper protocols had been followed. And this is actually a very interesting thing which we don't often think about. We think of the post office being the final stop for a piece of mail that is undeliverable, but in fact, the frontier office or the border office, where the mail came in from a foreign country or returned outwards from a foreign country, was actually the final point to check that everything had been done correctly. There we go. This I find fascinating. On the right hand side on the form on the third bullet point down, it indicates that these new etiquettes or labels would begin numbered at 399 to 406. This is a Belgian marking. And I just think that's very strange. If they've never used the labels before, nobody has ever been able to figure out why they started at 399. But for whatever the reason is, first 8 Belgian labels or 7 Belgian labels were number 399 to 406. Okay, so the French forerunners. By 1881-82, labels were beginning to be produced in France. These labels were small imperf rectangles, 25 by 12 millimeters, with a box text, a frame text in blue. Printing was done by lithography in sheets of 80, 5 by 16, and comprised 10 variants in all. I won't insult you by attempting to pronounce these in French, but let me just say the first one is unknown, the second is obviously refused, the third is the party has moved on with no forwarding address, décédé is deceased. The parvenu label indicates that something about the address wasn't correct. Either it wasn't a real address or the address as stated was unknown. Address incomplete, not claimed, and then of course the dead letter office, the rebut marking, which indicates that it couldn't be returned because there was no way to be able to assess who the person was who in fact had sent it. These you find very often on postcards, which don't contain a return address very often. So each sheet had 8 examples of each sort. Strangely, except the refused label, of which there were 16 on each sheet. Douglas Muir, who's the reigning dean of all things postal labels, made the interesting point that the unknown label, the inconnu label, is the most used, regardless of which country, of all the postal labels. So it's very funny that at the beginning, refused was printed twice as much on the sheet. I guess the assumption was that mail would be taxed coming from out of the country and people would not want to pay the postage due. But it's just an interesting little detail. Rebut was used when it was necessary to direct a letter to the returned letter or in some instances dead letter office. Okay, in 1865, these labels were replaced by a box version. This sheet that you see on the right actually comes from the French Postal Museum. This is the 1885 labels. This is from their strike book to show how they were. They were still imperfed and printed in blue by litho with the text appearing in uppercase. All the labels and subsequent French types appear to have been printed at the Imprimerie Nationale in Paris, but that was reported in an early philatelic journal, and no one has ever been able to actually confirm that. They've never been able to find the source for it. The use of these labels is not known before 1900 and not at the same time as the later black labels that we'll see later on. So therefore, these are actually extremely rare. Okay, we're going to get to the postal history in a second. If this unsubstantiated information is in fact true, the inspiration for the use of these labels can be found in Germany, because the German suggestion to the UPU includes much of the same French wording found in later French labels. However, it would appear the original idea and wording originated in France and was later presented by Heinrich von Stephan to the UPU. It depends on who you speak to, which order this came in. Either von Stephan presented it and the French took it up and produced the labels, or conversation had happened with the French, and von Stephan took it to the UPU. So regardless, the German labels would have substantially reduced the size of the text to accommodate the need for both German and French terms. Subsequent French labels, although similar, follow the pattern agreed upon by the UPU in 1887. So how did it work? Upon discerning an issue with a select piece of mail, it's the postman that begins the process. The postman would notate the reason for non-delivery on the reverse side of the envelope. On return to the post office, a decision was made as to how many attempts would be made to re-deliver the piece. And these can often be found, at least in France and Belgium and Luxembourg, by the number of small numbers that are surrounded by a circle, and they're very tiny, and that's the postman's mark, so they could trace which postman had actually attempted to deliver it. So we can tell to a certain extent how many times they tried to deliver these things. Once it became clear it couldn't be delivered, a label or a hand stamp was placed on the reverse, confirming the reason for non-delivery. So here's an example of the process, and this pretty much shows all of it. If you look up here, the postman has written on what the issue is. Here are the number of times on the bottom that the piece was designed to be delivered. In this particular case, it was sent through 2 different brigades. Don't forget that the post, especially early, mail was delivered sometimes 5 or 6 times a day, and so there were different brigades. So this tells us that the brigades from both the morning and the evening had made the attempt to deliver this. This hand stamp here says that it was unknown at the call. So the final treatment before it was sent back to the frontier office to be returned was to assemble the postman while they were sorting their mail, read out the address, and ask if anyone knew who this person was or where they were. And you can see that this was done in both Brigade A and B, and that's why it's referred to as unknown at the call. Finally, on the front, this was to be returned to sender, and the reason was clearly stated on the front. The person to whom the mail was sent was unknown. Here are some third generation labels. What's fascinating about these, they were used printed into the early 20th century. One of the things that I find most fascinating, depending on the country that you're examining, is the question of why they stopped using labels and went to hand stamps. It would appear that almost everybody started with labels. The UPU seemed to prefer the idea of the label. In the case of England, there actually were postal labels used, and they're unbelievably rare. If you see an English postal label with English and French on it, grab it, because they were passed almost immediately. The British decided that cutting a little piece of paper out of a sheet took 5 times the amount of time as socking it with a hand stamp. And so the British abandoned the label almost from the get-go. These French labels, of course, later on are perforated, which makes it much easier. But in the beginning, it was quite a labor-intensive process, which may explain why the French abandoned it reasonably quickly, the idea of labels. So let's take a look at some of how things changed for each hand stamp or label over the course of time. So here's a very early return label, or return hand stamp from France. This is 1866, and you'll notice that what's missing is there's no department indicated underneath the term return to sender or return to writer. It was just a star. And these are the earliest incarnation of these. Here's another one from 1867. Notice this is and this is an internal letter from inside the country, but you'll notice that there's no indication given as to why the piece of mail is being returned. By 1868, they had discovered that it was important to include the department number so that it could be certain that the letter had gotten to the home, to the post office in the city in which it was to be delivered. 1875, we're still using the same format. I love these registration hand stamps that appear at the top of this. That's not what we're talking about today, but I've a nice collection of those. They're very interesting to collect. Sorry for the quality of this one. 1888, you can see this is very consistent, both in terms of the registration label and also the return marking. By 1894, we're keeping exactly the same protocol, although this is a new hand stamp now. The problem with hand stamps, of course, is they eventually wear down and have to be replaced. And this is an example of a replacement hand stamp. You can tell by the width and size of the lettering that's involved in it. It is actually fascinating if you have the patience to follow the use of a hand stamp or various hand stamps from various periods in a particular city. Gradually, little bit by little bit, you can see where the number of hand stamps that were in use in that post office and when one would be replaced, and both the first and second generation would be used at the same time. And then gradually the first generation wears out and you don't see that one anymore. It's fascinating if you have a mind that works that way. Again, 1896, this is a much heavier hand stamp at this point. 1899, we're following exactly the same pattern. Now, in 1901, around 1900, the inclusion of the department marking tends to disappear to some degree, especially in smaller cities. 1904. This is a spectacular cover. We could have an entire meeting on maybe another time. But this is still 1907, and you can see in the upper left-hand corner that the number of departments and post offices have grown significantly, but the actual format remains the same. Notice on the bottom, there are several manuscript markings from the postman in the street making delivery, indicating that it wasn't able to be delivered because it was unknown. And by 1917, we begin to see that the number of the department begins to disappear on newer hand stamps. 1921, this is one of the older generations, but still exists. By 1922, we're starting to get a boxed hand stamp, rather than one that does not necessarily indicate the department, and most likely doesn't. Here it is, 1932. This one interesting because the stamp on the bottom indicates is a postman stamp and not a department number. That stayed in effect into almost the mid-1940s. Okay, so now let's go on to a different of the mandated labels. The UPU indicated that there were certain things that needed to be included in your country's selection of these things. And the second one was the party is left without a forwarding address or has moved. This is an 1825 cover where this is actually indicated as you would expect at this period by manuscript on the back. But by 1870, this is a remarkable early example, and I'm never convinced that this letter began with, or this label began with this, um, uh, with this. There are no recorded examples of that label with perforations. Um, it's potentially was added later on, or I'm not 100% about that. But it's a really spectacular, uh, in excellent shape example of that early label. By 1892, already this label is being replaced by a hand stamp. Again, this boxed rectangular style of label of hand stamp marking is really something that one will find in France specifically. It's almost possible to tell the French markings because they're all in these rectangular boxes, which contain no curves, no chamfering, no nothing. So by 1893, that label is pretty much gone and it's being replaced by this hand stamp, which, as we expect from the last one, we can see 1895 remains consistent. Here's a label used in 1904. That's quite a late use of this label. Although they were still in existence, they were being eased out of use again because it required a lot more effort. So 1904, that's quite a late use. Here's the hand stamp also in 1904. It would appear that the larger post offices, the city post offices, were the ones to go through their labels first. And so, as you would expect in that circumstance, getting so much more mail, the labels disappear quite early in large city post offices. But in some of the smaller ones, you'll see the labels used, for quite a while because they just didn't have that much returned mail, at least not international mail. 1906. 1913. Here's another example of this label that we had seen in 1904, and it's interesting that it covers up that return to sender hand stamp underneath, which again makes me question whether this actually originally began that way. 1926. This label, it's slightly changed here, the dimensions change, but this type of hand stamp and format of hand stamp will continue into the 1950s. I mean, you have to give the French and the British great marks for consistency. I was once at an international conference with a French collector and a British collector who spent better part of a half an hour arguing who was more consistent in their application of postal regulations, whether it was the British or the French. I don't remember the outcome, but they certainly could tie for certain. Okay, then probably the most common, as Douglas Muir has pointed out, the most common used hand stamp or label in any post office is the unknown one. This is the earliest recorded use of an unknown hand stamp in France, 1827. Some interesting things here. I mean, if you look under the divorce marking at the bottom, already, even in pre-stamp mail, pre-philatelic mail, they were indicating the number of the department. Quite remarkable. 1869, this is the only example I know where the in canoe, the unknown at the call marking was actually appears both in red and in black. I don't really understand the reason for that. Perhaps it was done twice. The front portion of this doesn't show that this was forwarded, so it's interesting in any event. The French were very, very very explicit about the fact that the marking should be made in red. So it's just interesting that it appears in both there. That was not always the case, by the way. 1887, this is a very unusual version of the unknown at the call marking. 1892, guess what? We've gone to the rectangular, square, single language. Of course, French is the UPU language, so there's no need for another one. Marking, which will remain consistent. 1896, 1898, 1904, 1922. This is actually quite an interesting marking. I did not understand what this marking was. And then a French collector showed me a collection of these that he had. This is most likely the hotel or apartment buildings marking, to say that it was returned, put back in the post because the person was not known at number 40. I mean, now that I know that, it makes sense, but at the time it was a bit confusing. 1938, you can see that at the bottom, same marking. And again, the marking was used into the 1950s, so very consistently. Décédé, or deceased, unable to be delivered because the recipient was deceased. Another often used hand stamp. You can see or label, you can see at the bottom, this is 1845. It's very interesting that this marking, deceased marking, is, I think, I have a handsome collection of them in my Belgian labels. But in France, it seems to have been one of the lesser used labels in hand stamps. Again, 1880, this is marked on this imprimé band. Handwritten in 1884. Handwritten again in 1894. No explanation for this, by the way, because the labels were produced, but it's not easy to find the Décédé labels. Here's an example of the third generation sheet, which was perforated, indicating that they had in fact been produced. But 1892, still being handwritten on the envelope. And then finally, by 1894, that third generation label begins to appear on mail. In some places, written 1895 manuscript marking. 1899, still no label, still no hand stamp. 1901. Again, I would love to know why this is the case. And in 1901, as we've come to expect, the rectangular hand stamp makes its appearance. And that continues on almost unchanged. 1902. 1912, we have a manuscript marking from not a particularly small post office. Hand stamp in 1917. This is a second or a re-engraved example of that hand stamp. You can tell by the heavier markings on it, heavier lines of the word and frame. 1927, this is the third generation of it. Again, if you go back, you can see the difference. The thing that gives away the second and third hand stamp is the shape of the accent grave, is it? In any event, the accent over the E. As you can see, in the second generation, it's flat, and in the third generation, it has a little bit of an angle to it. Even in 1921, we're still getting manuscript markings. 1942 is the latest one that I've ever seen, and obviously it's one of the rare of the original UPU return labels, and you could even say markings, I would say, because they certainly don't exist greatly before the 20th century. Refusé. Even the hand stamp for refusé is quite difficult to find. This cover comes from 1951. What's fascinating about this is the original set of labels that were printed, if you recall, had the double number of refusee labels compared to everything else. And yet it's a very, very hard one to find. In spite of the evidence that labels existed from the first printing for the not claimed, I've never seen one used on cover. This is an example of the hand stamp. Here's a non réclamé hand stamp 1924. And 1927. 1928, fascinatingly, to Tunisia. But that's it. It's very hard to find those. Similarly, the sent to an address that either doesn't exist or isn't correctly labeled, the parvenu label exists, but the actual hand stamps and use of the label, very difficult to find. Here's an 1868. This is the same hand stamp that you just saw at the beginning. And there's a 1901 boxed version, rectangular version, as we said. 1903, unchanged. 1911. 1920, badly struck, but the same hand stamp. 1922. I think it's interesting that this that there are two strikes of this on here, but in any event. And 1938, this is now a new hand stamp. But what doesn't exist is the label. And I have probably, of all the labels that I have that are not fixed to a piece of postal stationery, the parvenu label is the one I have the most of. Maybe because it was used the least. I'm not 100% sure, but it's if you find one on a piece of French mail or an international return to from France, it's worth hanging on to. So in many cases, the rarity of the labels may result from being used less than other labels, as we just said. This is a very rare label, which I love because it has the marginal markings on it, which is that this name is common to numerous people, and so we don't actually know who this, which one of those people this should go to. 19th century uses of that label are extremely rare. However, there was a hand stamp. Early evidence suggests the existence of a longer and narrower two-line marking than the boxed version, which we've seen. And since then, I've discovered this wretchedly pixelated hand stamp, which I've purchased but not gotten yet. So the thing about this hand stamp is it tends to be 3 lines. It's one of the only ones that's actually 3 lines.
Zoom in.
Refusee is sometimes seen as refused due to the tax. It's tax-free depending that it was refused because of the tax. This is actually a really interesting document. It's from 1812. And this piece was refused because of the tax, which the person that was receiving it insisted was incorrect. So it was taken back to the post office where they were proven to be right. It should have only been 5 centimes, and it was corrected, as you can see on the left, and sent back to the original recipient, where it was then the postage due was paid. This is one of the later additions to the auxiliary markings catalog. It appears that it was never used extensively as a label, but only as a hand stamp. This is the only label that I've actually seen, and it's from 1927. I'm not sure where why it was kicking around a drawer in Paris somewhere, and have less of an idea as to why it has a red mark across the top. But that's the latest I've seen. Insufficient address. No evidence exists for the use of this label before 1900, and I've actually never seen a copy of it. So if you come across insufficient address marking before 1900, you have something that's probably pretty special. So in the address incomplete hand stamp seems to have been the first incarnation of the insufficient address marking. This one is from 1849. Here's the box version that was in existence until 1962. So that particular terminology had a much longer and extensive used extensively compared to the insufficient address marking or label. And that concludes the presentation for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I don't know if anybody has any questions or not. You may be glazed over. You look like my graduate students all sitting there like they're all so excited when it says thank you. That concludes today's lecture. Good. Well, our hope is to, and I say this to our friends who are listening online as well, after the fact, our hope is to develop this program so that we can do these Zoom topics more frequently with the Auxiliary Markings Club. So if there's something that you would find interesting or you would like to present something, we'd be thrilled to have you do it. And you can get in touch with me. I'll put my email address in the chat, but please let us know if you're interested, and we will make that happen.
Greg, this is Gary Lowe.
Hi, Gary.
I just want to thank you for a really very thought-provoking presentation. Your continued reference back to the UPU as the cause of a lot of these policies, procedures, regulations, I think is very, very helpful. I'd like to see more presentations of this type where we get to understand the reason behind a lot of the covers that we see. It's all well and good to do rates and routes and markings, of course, here. But what you did is you gave us an understanding of why it was done the way it was done. So I want to thank you for that. That was just great.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That means a lot coming from you. So your research and your many articles on this and your course that you did for the APS has been a great inspiration to many of us. So thank you for
Well,
thank you for
thank
that as
you. I
well.
appreciate that.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Well, if you're not a member of the Auxiliary Markings Facebook page, you don't have to be a member of the group to see that, and that's where we list all of our meetings that are coming up in addition to the website and the newsletter. So if you'd like to do that, that would be great. And in the meantime, I wish you all a happy rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Greg.